Welcome to the Neophytes of Narratology, the internet's most pretentious and pseudo-intellectual pursuit since, perhaps, Nietzsche's thus podcast Zarathustra, or Camus' renowned Vlog of Sisyphus. While lesser men aspire to stand on the shoulders of mere giants, we at the Lost Signals will accept nothing less than titans. So join us as we delve into the fundamentals of narrative nuance and critique the critics who proclaim to know the universal qualities of effective storytelling.
Hello, and welcome back to Neophytes of Syntax Narratology, because we're doing sort of a crossover episode. Syntax Error, by the way, is coming back soon, directly after this episode, so be sure to check that out, and it will be live and in film for the first time on the Lost Signals. But tonight, we're discussing an article that Ian has found for us. I, of course, remain Scott Thurlow. Ian Manzer.
Yes, I found it.
And Stephen Amosi.
I'm also here.
Are here with me, and it is an article that was originally, or at least, I don't know if it was originally, but it was listed on Game of Sutra's website, if anyone's familiar with that, and it's called The Uneasy Merging of Narrative and Gameplay by, apologies in advance if I mispronounced the author's name, Ara Shirinian. So, it touches upon things that we ourselves have touched upon a bit, but I think it delves into it in a bit of a different angle and more in-depth than perhaps we ourselves, or at least recently, have done. So, E, why don't you give us a little bit of sort of overview of the article?
Okay, well, the author is a game developer, having developed games such as Night Sky and The Red Star, which I've heard of neither of those, but I'm sure they're fantastic games. And the article is basically discussing that gameplay and narrative are kind of in conflict with each other, and that in current game, in gaming culture, there's a movement for heftier narrative in gameplay. And the author's discussing why this might not necessarily be a good choice.
Not good,
but that
they conflict with each other.
Yeah, and that the idea is that either like in a novel or in a film has aspects of narrative that they're allowed to do, which games can't do. Sure. And there are things that games can do in narrative that those cannot do. But in general, you can't have like a perfect narrative in a gameplay, at least going through traditional.
Not in the way that we view as such, sure. And just real quickly, do you remember what year this article is from? I think it's 2012. I don't know if I have it in front of me. It's pretty recent, that is to say, 5 or so years.
Well, there is a line in the article that says video games in 2009 still largely feature those same
so at least
ingredients.
After that.
So I would say probably around 2009.
Actually, it says the copyright here is 2017 from UBM Tech. But
I think Game of Sutra just released this as
it was originally part of the blog. Anyway, that's not kind of here. I just want to get a simple
one of the major examples they give is Metal Gear Solid 4. So that's about the date of when it...
Yeah, and so I want to point out, so I'll start off with, I enjoyed this article quite a bit because, of course, this is one of the things I'm interested in probably the most, merging a lot of things we talk about on the Lost Sigs.
And because it used BioShock as an example.
Well, I mean, I don't see how you cannot use BioShock, but certainly that's not the only example they used. Half-Life 2 was another one. There's a number of them, and as you just said, Metal Gear, and a bunch of other games, just Shenmue as well. But I just want to point out, in the opening 2 paragraphs or so, he writes that the video game is arguably a singular, unique medium that can be considered a container for all other media that came before it, which is something Phil Fish ostensibly said, pretty much, at some point. So I just thought that, I wrote just Phil Fish next to that quote, but that's something, that point itself is something I like to talk about and point out to people who aren't as familiar or as in-depth because of the way the medium works, and he'll delve into, like you said, the conflicts between trying to sort of bolt those two aspects together.
I like that idea, and I think that it's important, and probably one that's maybe obvious to people that are really into playing games, and completely not obvious to others that don't play games a lot. And I think it's a really important distinction that there's this idea of you can combine audio, visual elements and this interactive element that I think is really important to, in some way, all of those are really important to all aspects of different types of art.
Sure.
And I think that's really
it's worth pointing out.
You need to, because it's so obvious, I guess, to a lot of game players, like people that play games all the time, perhaps they don't even think about it in such a in-depth way as this article goes into, which I think is really cool.
Yep.
So one of the first examples he starts to bring up with the conflict between narrative and gameplay went into like the early games that established how kind of film approaches narrative and visually, which you want to have a very tight control over what the audience is consuming. But because you have to have an interactive aspect to it, things such as QuickTime Events, in a sense, to allow you have that allows tight control and still have the interactive element, and that in a sense, it's you press a button to continue a cutscene, or you fail it and you have to repeat it, and that QuickTime Events are actually kind of very maligned in gaming culture.
Well, they've become that at this point. Well, sure.
I would like to point out here, actually, while you're mentioning QuickTime Events, that I think it's really interesting how they work, because they completely separate the ideas of gameplay and narrative. There's narrative happening on the screen when well done. QuickTime Events have narrative happening on the screen.
Broadly narrative, we'll say.
But you literally don't have to pay attention to that at all. That's the entire idea of QuickTime Events, is that you just have to follow the instructions that are given to you, and you don't actually have any control over what the narrative is, which presents an interesting conundrum, I guess. And I think he talks about that a little bit.
But I think that if you go on the spectrum of having a game, but to the extreme of having narrative, is just you pressing buttons to continue the narrative. And I think that's where that lies on that spectrum.
Sure, and he does make that point, but while I enjoyed, like I said, this article overall, I thought it was very well written and point out a lot of important things, I'm not sure if I agree that's true to that degree, because at least the way you phrase it, Steve-O, that I don't have to pay attention to the narrative at all, like whatever, like the thematic elements that are happening on screen, because I'm paying attention to the button prompts, essentially.
It's not necessarily that. It's just that you literally, as long as you're doing button prompts, you have no control over the narrative. Whereas
sure.
there are times, all
right, I get what you mean.
There are like that narrative is going to happen no matter what.
Regardless.
You have to press the right buttons in order to move the narrative forward. It's basically an FMV that you have to play a mini game through.
But that's the point I was trying to make, is that it's going to the extreme of narrative and having minimal gameplay involved.
Yeah.
Do you have another point to make about this specific topic? Because I want to bring up something he doesn't bring up.
No, I wanted to just touch on something broadly as well. Like, I see what you guys mean now, and maybe we'll explore it later on a bit as we incorporate other points. But I think this maybe is the phrase from the article itself that sort of encapsulates what we just said. Again, early on in the intro-ish section, he writes, strictly speaking, the two forms of media that video games are best and perhaps uniquely suited to express are visual narratives, like we said, like film, and gameplay, which is specifically a subset of human-computer interaction, which would be the button prompts.
Right.
So, that's sort of I think the QT perhaps, maybe exemplifies the fine line you have to balance between incorporating those two elements. Look at Eddie.
I think I believe he touches upon this within the article, but I think I want to explore it a little bit more. Is what I feel is the next step on the spectrum, which in a way is the equivalent of a choose-your-own-adventure novel reading, which
we pointed out in previous episodes. But I mean, it still stands.
Which you do have an element of choice there, but it's still almost it's sort of a QuickTime event, almost like all the Telltale games. And a lot of other games which involved,
similar.
A lot of
like Life is Strange and stuff like that.
Yeah, or if you want to go to certain RPGs where you're picking from choices in dialogue
tree, yeah.
You get more of an illusory choice in the narrative, but it's still you pressing a button and
to continue
being kind of pushed on this line of what the story the author of the game wants you to hear.
Sure.
I like what you just said there, Scott, and it puts me in the mind of QuickTime events, while they can be enjoyable, little I mean, they're pretty much mini games in and of themselves.
Yeah, you're right. I can be okay with calling them
within whatever game you're playing. And like when you said you push a button to continue, it reminded me of like the old arcade games where it's just like a more
elaborate version of that,
intense version of like, you know, press this button to continue, and like you just have to press a bunch of different buttons in a perfect order in order to continue the narrative.
I get it, but I'm going to give 2 examples that the article itself doesn't, from games, that I think maybe go beyond sort of what we just said for QuickTime Events. One is from Resident Evil 4, which is one of my favorite games, possibly the best Resident Evil, one of the, if not. So that's, while QuickTime Events were present in games before that, for example, you're escaping from like a boulder. It's like an Indiana Jones thing, essentially. But in order to do that, you're pressing the QuickTime prompts. But you still have to like watch your character in an exciting action, basically a thematic scene. You know, dodge here, this and there, and like Leon's rolling down. And if you don't press R2 and R1 like the same time, then you die.
Right.
You have to restart. So like, yeah, it's sort of a mini game, but action is still happening. I'm just saying, while you're doing the mini game. And so you have to sort of like pay attention to both in some sense.
But I think the point is, I'm sorry, Ian, I'll let you go in a minute, but like I think the point of that section is that what your gameplay and your narrative are completely separate from each other.
Sure, I get that.
They're completely separated. Like you could be blind and be following like somebody telling you what buttons to push, and you would come out with the same
result. Yeah,
result.
I get it.
You don't have to actually see or hear what's going on in game, quote unquote. You're
right. Perhaps that's the important distinction here.
So before I go on to what this next point I want to make, I feel that the author is more on the side of gameplay's importance to video games than it is.
I somewhat got that out of it, but I don't necessarily begrudge that point either.
But he does bring up an aspect where if you go back to like kind of the old Atari games or something like that, where you're given almost no story whatsoever, and that the human condition to look at.
Sure.
We actually did a TED talk, I think, on this, where you'll watch spheres on a screen
and impart a story,
to it,
make a story about it. Yeah,
sure.
And there's that point to it, but there. So on the very far spectrum, you have no story whatsoever, but all gameplay. But again, the distinction he makes is for a video game to exist, it has to be a game. So what's interesting to me is what's that middle ground there, and what he's arguing for the middle ground.
I want to touch upon the main point you just said, because it's addressing the article itself, and I'll read the quote here. There's an important implication in games. If it has any discernible graphics at all, there is always some sort of story or narrative being told to you, or at least being interpreted by you as you play. Indeed, humans are really good at constructing narratives about what happened to the bloody Nick sword in the corner, even if there's none told to you outright in the game.
Yeah.
Now, to give me a personal one, I played Inside recently, which had no story whatsoever except for contextual,
environmental stuff.
And,
sure.
Sounds like Dark Souls.
Yeah, and that's a great example too. That there's so much that is built into this world that I guess the question I'm going to ask is, I feel that his end thesis is that gameplay and narrative can exist simultaneously, but you can't meld them together to as, let's say, Hideo Kojima wants it to be.
Or perhaps they just haven't figured out how to do that yet. I think with any medium, there's always that striving towards the perfect melding of all the elements of it. It doesn't matter what it is. You know, in movies, you want the perfect balance of like great cinematography and audio and, you know, just amazing visuals and things like that. And I think that he's saying that perhaps video games are maybe a little bit more complicated in that sense, at least as far as like you need to try to balance the narrative and the visual and the gameplay aspect of it.
Now, I may be skipping ahead a bit, but to touch upon what Ian just said, and I think the metaphor he uses was something like, it's not like you need the perfect balance, or the perfect recipe, I believe, is what he used, of gameplay and narrative, as if it were peanut butter and chocolate, like at the right mixture and the right temperature, then they'll combine. Right. It's more as if like you want the right tool for what you're trying to impart. So like sometimes you won't always necessarily use narrative cutscenes or whatever, or conversely, vice versa, you might not need the other one, based
you
on
might go very heavy on them.
Exactly.
Again, I brought up that I felt that he came from a point of view of a gameplay perspective.
Of course, because he's a game developer.
Yes. So I'm going
not to disparage that in any way.
Yeah, I'm going to come through what I feel is a narrative problem that, or an issue that gameplay forces upon narrative, which I don't think he brings up in this, which is that the nature of gameplay means that there has to be losing conditions there. Mm-hmm. And that
maybe
gameplay
traditionally,
if there's no losing condition, it's not a. All right, there has to be.
I may have one counter example, but I'll let you continue.
And the fact that losing condition there and having the replay, the need to replay certain aspects of games over and over again interrupts the flow of a narrative.
For sure.
And he sort of brings that up with the idea that narrative can make time jumps, which games cannot, because there's continuity in games.
Although Rocky example of that,
which is quite, I like that a lot, but I get it.
I think that you can have montage sequences and other aspects in games. So I didn't really feel that was the strongest point, but I did feel that
I want to address
it. If you're in a game and you're really like, I'm going to use a game that is most meant to be like a film. That's a series that's out now.
Uncharted?
Uncharted, yes. The fact is, if you keep dying at a sequence, you've lost the narrative flow.
Sure. If I don't climb the cliff as Nathan Drake, then I go to see what happens in the next treasure room.
So I feel that's like that break can interrupt a good narrative flow, and you can't not have those kind of game win-loss conditions.
All right, Steve wants to address something, and I would also like to after him.
I mean, so as far as the win-loss condition thing, there is a way to have that narrative flow. Like, I'll just go over the Rocky example that he gives very quickly. So, like, in the film Rocky,
wherever he fights Drago.
It doesn't matter.
The Russian one.
One of them. It probably happens in all of them. But like he talks about how they cut away to like audience reactions and they cut away to like all this stuff. And he says like you can't do that and have continuous game flow. And you're right, Ian, to an extent. You can actually do that in a game. Mm-hmm. However, when you do that, you are verging over onto the side of narrative and verging away from gameplay.
Sure.
If you're looking at the audience reaction, then you are not allowed to have that moment of gameplay. That's a moment. That's an FMV, really. Yeah. It's a moment of non-gameplay.
You can't have it's one or the other.
So you cannot have in a game where that's important have something important happening there because you can't, as a player, see it and therefore you can't react upon it. Right? So like it's not under your control as a player, therefore it's a moment of narrative and it's not a moment of gameplay. It's not that combined moment that I think is talking about. And that's basically what I wanted to react on with what you with what you were just talking about.
That's a very good point, and I have sort of like a lesser-ish one, but perhaps consider a walking sim type game where you're literally just going through an environment. I'm not sure if there might be a lose condition in such a game. Dear Esther is the one that comes to mind, and unlike say something like Vanishing Ethan Carter or something like that, where they're in puzzles and stuff to solve, I believe if I recall correctly, Dear Esther is just you wandering around a locale, and like sure you can uncover basically I want to call them audio logs, but not really. Like you go to a certain location, like right, it's tagged like you're in this general zone, and you get like another piece of narrative. Basically, get the protagonist of the story in quotes giving you a slice of his history or whatever. But I've never seen it a way to die in it.
Yeah. Now, that's actually a very interesting point where that's verging, I think, even bridging the gap between the QuickTime events and perhaps you don't have any agency in a walking sim.
Well, you have the agency where to walk, but there's only so far to walk. Sure.
And that's why I enjoy walking sims quite a bit, but I enjoy narrative quite a bit. I'm here for the story, not the choice. But there's another one, to the point of the interruption of narrative. There's a comedian I really like, Dara O'Brien, who was giving an example of being a video game player. I was playing one of the Grand Theft Autos, and he kept dying in in this one mission, but he had to steal a car and cross a bridge where he had to pay a toll. and go. And he's like, after the 6th time I died, I realized I was stuck in a commute.
Yeah, it's really funny. But you can impart, like, I guess it. That's really.
But the point is that he's making a joke about that. That's pretty good. But it's pointing to that he's no longer a brilliant criminal action adventure hero, but a guy schlepping his way to work.
Or even brilliant criminal adventure heroes still have to commute to work.
Perhaps it's that, but
best narrative of all time.
There is in fact a line in the article itself, I think, that sort of summarizes what we were just talking about, and it reads, when we allow unrestricted cinematic narrative expression during gameplay, the gameplay itself must either be severely limited or completely decoupled from the narrative, right? Like you said, Steve, it can't, like, if something important narratively is supposed to be happening, you can't just like randomly splice that in during hardcore like gameplay parts because it'll be basically dissonance from each other.
This is the idea. This is the right around the Half-Life 2 point, right? Let me finish. Let me let you finish, and then
no, that's pretty much. I just wanted to like.
All right, so that's the case, and then so they talk about Half-Life 2, and this is kind of a brilliant point that he brings up, and I really love this point. So he talks about in Half-Life 2 how when you're in cutscenes, you in fact full range
gameplay control
of looking around. What they have to do as developers at that point is to focus your vision and make you want to look at what you're supposed to be looking at, which is kind of, it makes their job harder for sure, but it's kind of brilliant. It's kind of a brilliant way to do things if you really,
of course, because it's more immersive.
The problem is
at the outset,
at that point, you can never have something unexpectedly bad. You can have something unexpected happen, but you can't have something unexpectedly bad happen that affects the gameplay. Because the second that you do that, then everyone will be not paying attention to what they're supposed to be paying attention to in those cutscenes, and instead be paying attention to whether or not somebody's trying to sneak up behind them and stab them in the back or something.
You're right. I think I like that the Half-Life 2 section.
That might be my favorite point
of
the
this
best, article.
And you're right about that. Like, it's something that Yahtzee pointed out in Zero Punctuation, that it becomes amusing because of the fact in Half-Life 2 that you can like fuck around with all the boxes and do whatever you want, like while Alex and Dr. like Bream or whatever like are talking.
Yeah.
But that's of course at least keeps the level of immersion like more than it would be if your control was completely taken away.
Right.
But at the same time, you can't just randomly then have a Vortigern or whatever like come behind me and attack me
because then you'll never pay attention to any cutscene ever again. It might work once,
like I like BioShock or whatever, but it might work once time. But then after that, you're no longer focusing on narrative. If indeed you want like the narrative to be the star, then the players are not going to do that because they'll be looking around every single corner for gameplay things that will be affecting them.
Exactly.
It reminds me of Red Dead Redemption a little bit, where you would get a hefty amount of world building done on the way to a mission.
Yeah.
Where you and another character would just be talking. You're still progressing towards
you're still controlling goal. Marston, but you're right about that. Yeah.
But if you notice, all of anything like that is always solely audio, right?
Well, he points that out as well.
There's not exactly, and that's part of this. It's like there's not a visual component of this. There's not a cutscene where you have control of your character or anything like that. Because if there was in Red Dead Redemption, at any point during his ramblings to you, like as you're fucking walking around.
Let's say exposition.
During this exposition, exactly, you can be attacked by something off the road or whatever, and you need to be aware of that. So the fact that it's only audio, so you have your visual senses available to you, and also other audio can cut into that. And that's very important to making that game work and allowing you to still understand and like follow the narrative in that.
Sure. So let's me think of a quick example. GTA would do that. So let's say you're driving on a mission with a partner or whatever, and he's like expositioning and like telling you like whatever, and then but if you crash or whatever, it cuts off the audio until you get back on the road and everything's like fine, and then it goes back, like it basically resets his speech, which I always found amusing. But like I get it, they have to have it. And if you don't do that, I don't know what else you would do really. But he does point that out, and I'll just read another quick quote that, of course, in BioShock, you were saying, Steve-O, narrative expression was often or frequently limited to the auditory channel in the form of diaries. So when narrative is limited to that audio, it means all other available channels remain opening for communicating narrative.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to allowing gameplay and narrative to happen at the same
exist
time.
In the comfortable space. Yeah.
You need to have open channels in order to take in what's going on around you and be aware of it, but also have that way of expressing the narrative of what's happening.
To convey whatever else, sure.
What I like about audio logs and, let's say, Skyrim for a second, which I think he said is Tolkien-esque amount of lore involved with it.
Whatever. One of the other scrolls.
It was optional. You know, if you so chose to get more invested in the world, you could through things. But I also think that art design and adding, as I mentioned, with Inside, is contextual visual clues to the world you're in. It is very important. Like BioShock did that very well with the environment told you a ton of what was happening in that specific area, and especially in the opening when you're just getting involved with the chaos. So I don't know. It was a very interesting article.
No, I agree, and again, it's things that like we certainly know about, but it's not often obvious that they're utilizing those various channels as they're called. An article in such a way. So sure, Half-Life 2 is the same thing. You could be hearing Barney talk about whatever while you're going past, like signs for the what was the name? Not the Coalition, the Covenant or whatever. Not the Covenant Halo. Whatever the alien little group was.
Whatever.
It's something with the C. It doesn't matter. I don't remember anymore. I should.
Combine.
The Combine.
That's right.
Right. So it's all that. So you're taking in all this stuff, but it's not quite overwhelming. But because they're able to use various channels in order to impart that, and also it's still gameplay because you could turn around.
I think Half-Life is a very interesting example of this because there are cutscenes that you can control your character, but nothing bad ever happens to your character during those cutscenes, and that's really important.
I can't think of a game that does that
because you would lose complete confidence in those cutscenes.
Exactly.
You would not focus on narrative. If that was the case, if somebody came up and stabbed you in the back while you were in one of those cutscenes, and then you had to figure out that, the next time I go through this cutscene, I have to watch out for somebody stabbing me back and stop that, then you would need to not pay attention to any of the cutscenes.
Of course, but I actually think that he brings that up with the fact that unless it was supposed to be stabbed in the back,
right? Like you've seen that before.
He does, but I would say in order to do that properly, you need to not give the player complete control, because as soon as they have complete control, they are going to be watching their back the entire time.
Well, never get the beauty of computer science and programming is the illusion of control, but you're in control the entire time.
Sure. Well, you're right.
But in Half-Life, you that's the entire thing. You're in control because you're controlling what is affecting the character, right? So they have these cutscenes where you can look around wherever the hell you want, but you want to, and they do this very, very well in that game. I really love Half-Life 2, but they do this very, very well in it because they have the most interesting thing that is possibly in your field of vision is what you're supposed to be looking at.
Yes, of course.
And they nail it in that game, and nothing bad happens to you. So there's no reason to look anywhere else other than what's happening. You can look at some boring boxes and stack some boring boxes.
That's all I was going to say.
Or you can pay attention to what's happening.
That's all I want to ask you. What else is there to look at in Half-Life scenes specifically? The fucking racks on the wall, that. Of course, the most interesting thing is going to be there. Right, but
exactly.
I still agree that the immersion factor remains.
Illusion, but sure. Also, it might seem like it gives you the idea that you can do anything else, but there's really nothing else to do other than pay attention to what the narrative
right,
is.
You're right, Steve. It's a very smart move, and I agree with that.
I don't know. I still like to spend 5 hours reading books in my games.
The Skyrim, Elder Scrolls stuff was great.
Yeah.
So you're right. Just I think the underlying thing of all this is that as the article states, in such a way that you have to establish a grammar of trust in narrative situations where the player actually has some control.
Right.
So the very thing you just said, but I think that's a very well phrased way of putting it.
It's a brilliant phrase, I think. Because that's exactly what it is.
So that's that. That was all very nice and interesting, and we mostly agree, I think, on that one.
Yeah, we're going to provide a link in the description.
I
recommend a read of this. It's pretty
check it out.
quick.
It's 15-minute read.
If you're interested in video games and I don't think there's any solutions in this, but it definitely does bring up some interesting ideas.
I found the actual quote from what I was saying, the metaphor. So instead of being peanut butter and chocolate, right? Think of it as gameplay is a fork and narrative is a knife. You have to use them differently in certain situations. You can't use both at once, or perhaps you can, or a spoon. I'm sorry, it was a spoon and a fork, or what? You know what I'm saying?
Well, I think the fork and knife thing is actually good because
it's spoons and knives.
Is it?
Yeah, sorry.
Well,
I'm trying to get
fork and knives is better.
Yeah. Either way, I like fork and knife better.
No, but see, you
honestly.
can.
But here's the thing. They should be used together However, you can't try to use them both in the same hand, right?
Like, yeah, all right. That's sort of a rephrase, but
I'm definitely going to try to use them in the same hand now.
I guess you certainly
can.
Well,
you can give it a shot. It's not going to work very well.
But I think at the end of the day, that's the whole point of the article. Like, there are instances in which you need your gameplay to act this way, and you need narrative not to be there, and vice versa. Mm. And when you use the right one in the right situation, it will be a great game, a la BioShock, a la Half-Life 2, a la Metal Gear, a la all the ones we talked about that did it well. Whereas if you try to randomly mesh them together at the same time, then it just becomes a mess, and neither of them work.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it was quite a very good article, and it's a good sort of lead-up intro precursor to Syntax Season 3 itself proper, and I enjoyed this one. So yeah, we'll put up a link and check it out. It's quite well done. Any final thoughts, my friends?
No, all right. I think we covered most of it.
We're going to be uneasily merging narrative and gameplay ourselves sometime soon. So we'll see you next time. I've been Scott Thurlow, here with Jane Manzer.
I demand the grand unification theory of narrative gameplay.
We'll make it happen. And Stephen Amosi.
Have a good night.
We'll see you next time.
Editing and engineering by Scott Thurlow. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.